Flies have brains. Flies have neurons very much like our own. If we know anything at all about the relationship between physical complexity and the possibility of having an experience and the possibility of having interests, we know that more suffering is visited upon this earth every time we swat a fly than when we kill a 3-day-old human embryo. And yet, the ethical argument never has to get made because of the deference we have for religious faith. Someone need only stand in the Oval Office or on the floor of the Senate and say, my faith teaches me that life starts at the moment of conception. There are souls in those human embryos, and one soul can't trump another. You can't sacrifice one soul to benefit another. End of argument. Well, on the one hand, we have these collections of 150 cells, and on the other, we have little girls suffering from diabetes and full-body burns. We've got men and women with Parkinson's disease. We have literally tens of millions of people suffering terrible torments which could one day be remediated by this research. Okay, I submit to you, if you think that the interests of a virtually microscopic collection of cells, if you had 10 of these in the palm of your hand right now, you would never notice. If you think that the interests of these organisms may yet trump the interests of a little girl with full-body burns, you have had your ethical intuitions blinded by religious metaphysics. No ethical argument would get you there. No argument that talked about human suffering and its alleviation would get you there. It's not enough to say that these collections of cells are potential human beings. Given genetic engineering, every cell in our body with a nucleus is a potential human being. Every time the president scratches his nose, he's engaged in a holocaust of potential human beings. This is literally so. Given the right conditions, let's just linger for a moment. I don't want to talk too much about stem cell research, but it really demonstrates the point that we never have to have the conversation because faith trumps rational argument on these subjects. Just take for a moment the claim that there are souls in this petri dish, that every human blastocyst, a 3-day-old embryo, is ensouled. Okay, well, unfortunately, embryos at that stage can split into twins. So what happens? We have one soul becoming 2 souls. Embryos at an even later stage can fuse back into what's called a chimera, a single individual, born of 2 embryos. So do we have 2 souls becoming 1 soul? This arithmetic of souls doesn't make much sense. So what I'm arguing for you tonight, and what I argue at some length in my book, is either we have good reasons for what we believe, or we don't. And faith is the license that religious people give one another to keep believing when reasons fail, to keep believing in the absence of evidence. And this is unacceptable in every other area of our lives. And it's actually unacceptable even if you take the wrong religious object. I mean, just imagine how a senator would be perceived if in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, he said, we really have not been praying to Poseidon enough. And that, after all, is his jurisdiction. That is the sea we're talking about. You can just imagine what a lunatic misuse of the human mind that would appear to be. It's not like someone discovered in the 3rd century that the biblical God really, really exists and Poseidon, he's just a myth. They have exactly the same status, except one has, to speak of the biblical God, something like 2 billion subscribers. Now, in the face of this rather obvious conflict between religious fundamentalism, certainly, and scientific rationality, many of us, many well-meaning, well-educated people, especially in the West, have created a kind of accommodation to modernity, and we call it religious moderation. Now, in my book, I say some very critical things about religious moderation. That's actually been some of the most controversial aspects of my argument. So I want to say those things now, so you get a taste of my heresy in full. The first thing to concede up front is that religious moderation is better than religious fundamentalism. That nobody flies a plane into a building because he's a religious moderate. Religious moderates are not organizing their lives around apocalyptic prophecy. And this is a very good thing. But religious moderation has some real liabilities. And the first is that it gives an extraordinary amount of cover to religious fundamentalism. Because moderates also have made it taboo to criticize religious faith itself, to criticize the basic project of thinking that you're a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian, of raising your children to believe that they are Jews or Muslims or Christians. Because religious moderates are still attached to that obeisance to tradition. They don't want anything too critical said about the people who really, really believe in the literal word of their holy books. And this is not serving us at this point. It's even taboo among religious moderates to notice the differences among our religions. That all our religions don't teach tolerance and compassion to the same degree. And where they do teach it, they don't teach it equally well. This is fundamentalists understand this. Our own fundamentalist demagogues, when Muslims start flying planes into our buildings, they say Islam is an evil religion. They don't have a problem noticing the differences among religions. Moderates are the ones who have given us these euphemisms. This idea that Islam, for instance, is a religion of peace that's been hijacked by extremists, and that Osama bin Laden is the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world, or the David Koresh of the Muslim world. Osama bin Laden is articulating a very plausible version of Islam that has more subscribers than we would like to admit. The doctrines of martyrdom and jihad are not fringe doctrines in Islam. This idea that death in defense of the faith is the best thing that could possibly happen to another human being. This really is a deal breaker, and this really is believed by millions of Muslims. To linger on this point for a moment, because it really is of excruciating relevance to us at this point. Where are the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers? I mean, if occupation were enough, if being conquered by an outside power and being hauled off to jails and tortured were enough to so derange a society that it would form a death cult, like we see brewing in the Muslim world, we should see Tibetan Buddhists blowing themselves up on Chinese buses. We should see Tibetan Buddhists thronging in the streets calling for the deaths of Chinese non-combatants. We do not see this, and we're profoundly unlikely to see it. Tibetan Buddhists believe a lot of wacky things about the nature of the universe. They don't believe those wacky things that you have to believe to form a death cult. It's not that it's impossible that Buddhism could inform this kind of behavior, and actually Zen Buddhism did, to some significant degree, inform the worldview of the kamikaze pilots during World War II. It's interesting to note, just as a Buddhist scholar, that one of the things Zen can be criticized for is not really focusing on compassion to the degree that other schools of Buddhism do. And there's this whole martial spirit and tons of martial metaphors in Zen Buddhism that lent themselves rather readily to Japanese nationalism. But there are differences among our religions. We are never, by any stretch of the imagination, going to encounter Jain suicide bombers. So Jainism is it's a religion of nonviolence. The more deranged you become as a Jain by your religious dogmas, you will become less and less violent. I mean, the really fundamentalist Jains wear cheesecloth over their mouths so they won't inhale bugs. the core of Jainism really is nonviolence. By no stretch of the imagination can you say that the core of Islam is nonviolence. Religious moderates are uniquely ill-placed to concede this. When the religious moderate sees the jihadist on the videotape say things like, "We love death more than the infidels love life," and then he blows himself up, it's the religious moderate who is left thinking, no, that couldn't be religion. I mean, that's propaganda, that guy must have lacked economic opportunities, or, the United States, our misadventures in the Middle East must explain that. That's not faith. Okay. Religious moderates don't know what it's like to be certain of paradise. Religious moderates don't know what it's like to really believe in the God of the Quran or of the Bible, the Old Testament or New. If all you have to do to satisfy yourself on this subject is consider the biographies of the 19 hijackers. Who were these guys who woke up on September 11th and decided to fly planes into buildings? They were college educated. Many of them had PhDs. They were middle class. These were not people who had personal histories of political oppression. They were not spending inordinate amounts of time agitating for regime change in the Middle East. What they were spending an inordinate amount of time doing is hanging out at their local mosque in Hamburg talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise and the evils of infidel culture. These were true believers. And you can get their worldview out of the Quran very readily. We are at war with Islamic fundamentalism, but not terrorism is a tactic. And it's a separate conversation to talk about what percentage of the Muslim world fits this description. And we're certainly, our policy now is not doing anything but alienate more Muslims and create more jihadists. But we have an extraordinary problem because the doctrine of Islam really, we are at war with Islamic fundamentalism, but the fundamental, we're only at war with Islamic fundamentalism because the fundamentals of Islam really are a problem. And I just want to make clear that I'm not talking about a race here. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm not talking about an ethnicity. I'm talking about John Walker Lynn, the white guy from Marin who went to fight with the Taliban. I'm talking about the logical consequences of ideas. One study, actually, of known al-Qaeda operatives found that 2/3 of them were college graduates and middle class. Well, only 52% of Americans have been to any college. Okay, this is not merely a problem of education. I don't know how many more architects and engineers need to fly planes into our buildings before we realize this is not merely a problem of education. Our situation is far more sinister than that. It is possible to be so well educated that you could build a nuclear bomb and still think you're going to get the 72 virgins in paradise. Now, another problem with religious moderation is that it represents a fundamentally unprincipled use of reason. It really is intellectually bankrupt. At least fundamentalists talk about evidence. You ask a fundamentalist why he believes that Jesus is coming back, and he'll give you an evidentiary story. He'll give you an argument. It's not a good argument, but he'll say things like, the New Testament confirms all of Old Testament prophecy, or all of the prophecies in the Bible have actually come true in history. These are not good, reasonable claims, but if this was true, this would be an argument for, maybe the Bible is emanating from some omniscient source. Okay, what do moderates talk about when you ask them why they believe in God? Moderates talk about meaning. This belief gives their lives meaning. They talk about the good consequences of believing as they do.